My name is Clara Finch. I'm in my mid-30s, and for most of my life, I've been the kind of person people describe as steady. Not loud, not dramatic. Dependable in a way that fades into the background. I've learned that when you don't demand attention, people often assume you don't need consideration either. I live a quiet life. I work responsibly, I show up when I say I will, and I rarely ask for more than what's offered. From the outside, that can look like confidence or complacency. In my family, it was usually framed as a strength. I was the one who could handle things, the one who wouldn't make it awkward, the one who didn't need reassurance. That label followed me for years, and I accepted it because it felt easier than correcting it. This story isn't about bitterness, and it isn't about revenge. There's no dramatic takedown, no public confrontation meant to humiliate anyone. What I'm about to share is quieter than that. It's about emotional erasure that happens politely. The kind that hides behind celebrations, traditions, and good intentions. The kind that's easy to dismiss until you can't anymore. The moment everything began to shift took place during what should have been a happy occasion, my cousin's graduation celebration. A day meant to honor achievement, family pride, and togetherness. I went in with no expectations beyond the obvious. I wasn't looking for validation. I wasn't prepared for conflict. I believed I understood my role, and I believed that role was harmless. But what was hidden unraveled faster than anyone anticipated. Not because I raised my voice, not because I exposed secrets, and not because I demanded anything dramatic. It happened because one honest conversation, spoken calmly without accusation, interrupted a pattern that had gone unquestioned for years. This story follows an internal journey more than an external one. It's about how being underestimated can quietly shape your sense of self, how dismissal becomes normalized when it's consistent and unchallenged, and how silence, when chosen intentionally, can carry more weight than confrontation ever could. I want to be clear about something before we continue. I'm not telling this story to assign blame or rewrite anyone as a villain. The people involved are complex, flawed, and human, just like me. This isn't a story about winning. It's a story about seeing clearly, and about what changes when you finally stop explaining your presence. If you've ever been described as easy when what you really were was adaptable, if you've ever realized that being agreeable slowly turned into being invisible, then parts of this story may feel familiar. I'm sharing it not to stir drama, but to offer perspective. Because sometimes the most powerful shifts don't come from loud declarations, but from quiet truths spoken once and never taken back. So before we move forward, I want to ask you something gently. No pressure, no judgment. Have you ever noticed the moment when you realized you were being overlooked and wondered how long it had been happening without you naming it? To understand what happened at my cousin's graduation, you have to understand who I was to my family long before that day. I wasn't the star. I wasn't the problem child either. I existed in a space that felt almost intentional, useful, pleasant, and largely unnoticed. If families had background music, I would have been the steady hum you only realize is there when it stops. I was the one who remembered birthdays without making a show of it, the one who helped clean up after gatherings without being asked. If someone needed a ride to the airport, help editing a resume, or someone to listen without judgment, my name came up, but quietly, almost as an afterthought. No one ever said Clara doesn't matter. It was subtler than that. They said things like, she's fine either way, or she doesn't mind, or, Clara, she's flexible. Over time, flexibility became my defining feature. And without realizing it, I let that definition harden. At family events, conversations flowed around me. People spoke to me, not with me. Updates about my life were summarized by others, often inaccurately, but with confidence. I learned to smile and nod, correcting nothing. It felt impolite to interrupt a version of myself everyone seemed comfortable with. When I achieved something, small promotions, personal milestones, it was acknowledged politely, then eclipsed by louder stories. I told myself that was normal, that not everyone needs applause, that being low-key was a virtue. And I believed it, for a long time. My cousin, the one graduating that day, had always been positioned as the opposite of me. Charismatic, celebrated, the kind of person whose successes gathered momentum simply by being announced. I didn't resent that. Truly, there was space for different kinds of people in a family, or so I thought. What I didn't see then was how contrast can turn into hierarchy when left unchecked. In family group chats, my messages were often acknowledged last, if at all. When plans were made, I was informed, not consulted. If I declined, the assumption was that I'd adjust later. And if I didn't show up, someone would say, "Oh, Clara couldn't make it," in a tone that suggested mild inconvenience rather than absence. I wasn't invisible, but I was translucent. The role I played was reinforced because I played it well. I didn't challenge narratives, I didn't demand clarification. I smoothed edges so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable examining them. And in doing so, I became safe, predictable, easy to overlook. What hurts most looking back isn't that they underestimated me. It's that I participated in my own underestimation. Not out of weakness, but out of habit. Out of the quiet belief that harmony was worth more than visibility. By the time the graduation celebration approached, my place felt fixed. I was there to support, to applaud, to blend into the background of someone else's moment. And I accepted that, because I didn't yet realize how much of myself I'd been editing out to maintain that peace. That day wasn't the beginning of the story. It was simply the day the pattern became impossible to ignore. The first moment that stayed with me from that day wasn't dramatic. No sharp words, no obvious slight, just something small enough that everyone else seemed to glide past it without friction. We were gathered at my aunt's house, the living room rearranged to make space for folding chairs and a long table heavy with food. Graduation banners hung slightly crooked on the wall, and a slideshow of photos played quietly in the background. My cousin at different ages, different stages, always centered, always celebrated. I arrived early, as I usually did, carrying a tray I'd prepared the night before. Nothing fancy, just something reliable. When I walked in, I was greeted warmly, but briefly. Hugs were exchanged. Then attention shifted back to last-minute preparations. I set the tray down, asked where it would fit best, and followed directions. I didn't mind. I rarely did. The first small cut came when my aunt began organizing family photos. She stood near the front of the room, calling names, arranging people in loose rows. "Parents here," she said, "grandparents in the middle, cousins on the sides." I stepped forward instinctively, moving toward an open space near the center. She looked at me, hesitated for half a second, then said, "Oh, Clara, could you step out for just a moment? We'll grab one with you later." Her tone was casual, efficient, like she was rearranging furniture. I nodded and stepped back, offering a small smile. It made sense, I told myself. This was my cousin's moment. The photo didn't need to be crowded. I stood near the doorway, watching the group compress into a tighter formation. No one questioned it, not my parents, not my other relatives. The camera flashed, laughter followed. Then another photo. And another. "Okay," my aunt said eventually. "Let's move on." There was no "wait, Clara," or "we forgot one," just momentum carrying everyone forward. I felt something tighten, not anger, exactly, more like confusion, a quiet recalibration. I told myself not to read into it, that I'd imagined the significance, that it was silly to feel anything at all. Later, during the meal, conversation flowed easily around the table. People reminisced, joked, and praised my cousin's achievements. At one point, someone asked about my work. Before I could answer, another relative jumped in. "Oh, Clara's always busy," they said lightly. "She keeps things running behind the scenes." It was meant kindly. I knew that. Still, it landed strangely, like a summary written by someone who hadn't read past the title. I smiled and nodded again, letting the moment pass. That's what I'd always done. Correcting it felt unnecessary, almost indulgent. But something about that day made it harder to ignore the accumulation. The way my presence was optional, the way my absence required no explanation, the way my identity could be condensed into a convenient phrase and set aside. The first small cut wasn't painful on its own. It didn't bleed. It didn't demand attention. But it was precise, clean. And once I noticed it, I couldn't unfeel it. I remember standing at the sink later, rinsing plates alongside my mother. She chatted about the event, about how proud everyone was, about how smoothly everything had gone. "It's nice when everyone just knows their role," she said, almost to herself. I looked at my reflection in the window above the sink. For the first time, I wondered what role they thought I knew, and when I'd agreed to it. That thought stayed with me long after the celebration ended, long after the banners came down, long after the photos were posted and shared. Because once you notice the first small cut, you start to feel the older ones you'd already learned to ignore. After that day, I tried to file the feeling away as oversensitivity. That's what I'd always done when something felt slightly off. I told myself that families are imperfect systems, that not every moment carries meaning, that intention matters more than impact. And for years, that logic had helped me stay calm, even grateful. But once a pattern is named, if only silently, it starts to echo. In the weeks following the graduation, small moments resurfaced in my memory with sharper clarity. Conversations I'd brushed past before replayed themselves differently. Not louder, just clearer. There was the time an extended family dinner was planned without telling me until the night before. "We assumed you'd be busy," someone said, and I had laughed because it was easier than asking why my schedule was always presumed flexible when no one ever checked. There were the group messages where decisions were made quickly and decisively before I had a chance to respond. If I disagreed later, it was framed as a complication. If I agreed, it was taken as confirmation that the plan had always been fine. Even compliments carried a certain shape. "Clara's so understanding. She never makes things difficult. She doesn't take things personally." Each one sounded positive on the surface, but together they formed a quiet expectation. Absorb, adapt, move on. And I did. I became skilled at explaining away my own discomfort. I told myself I valued peace, that I didn't need recognition, that asserting myself would only create unnecessary tension. And sometimes that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. What I was really doing was normalizing dismissal because it had become familiar. Familiarity has a way of disguising harm as routine. I noticed how often I adjusted my plans to accommodate others, and how rarely the reverse happened. How often I listened, supported, showed up, without being asked how I was doing beyond the surface. How my silence was interpreted as consent. The most unsettling realization wasn't that people overlooked me. It was that they trusted me to be okay with it. At another family gathering a few months later, a relative joked about how I was the easy one. Everyone laughed. I smiled automatically, then felt the weight of the word settle differently this time. Easy. Easy to exclude. Easy to assume. Easy to forget. I could have said something then. A light correction, a clarifying sentence. But years of practice held me still. I didn't want to disrupt the mood. I didn't want to be seen as sensitive or demanding. And beneath all that, there was a deeper fear. What if I spoke up and nothing changed? So I stayed quiet, convincing myself that silence was maturity, that self-restraint was a strength. But silence, when it is expected of you, stops being a virtue. It becomes a role others rely on. I started noticing how that role extended beyond family. In professional settings, I was often the one tasked with smoothing conflicts, filling gaps, and making sure everyone else succeeded. I was praised for being reliable, but rarely considered for leadership. I told myself I preferred it that way. The truth was harder to admit. I had learned to equate worth with usefulness, not presence. And once that belief takes root, it spreads easily. The disrespect wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It arrived wrapped in trust, in familiarity, in the assumption that I would continue to accommodate because I always had. What changed wasn't the behavior around me. It was my awareness of it. I began to see how often my needs were treated as secondary. Not because anyone explicitly decided they mattered less, but because no one had ever been taught to consider them, including me. Normalizing disrespect doesn't happen all at once. It happens in increments, in the choice not to speak, in the habit of minimizing, in the quiet agreement you make with yourself that this is just how things are. By the time I recognized that pattern, it had already shaped years of my interactions. And undoing it wouldn't be loud or immediate. I knew that instinctively. Something in me was shifting, but not toward confrontation, toward clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't ask for permission. Once I saw the pattern, I started noticing how carefully my role had been constructed, not through a single decision, but through repetition. It wasn't imposed on me one day. It was shaped slowly, reinforced every time I complied without comment. I was the reliable one, the backup plan, the person who could be counted on to fill gaps quietly and without recognition. If something needed to be done and no one volunteered, eyes would drift toward me, not expectantly, but comfortably, as if my participation was already assumed. In family dynamics, roles have a way of hardening into identity. Someone becomes the successful one, someone else the sensitive one, and someone, almost invisibly, becomes the stabilizer. That was me. I smoothed over disagreements, I adjusted expectations. I made sure things worked, even when they weren't designed with me in mind. And because I did it well, no one questioned whether I wanted to. At gatherings, I was seated wherever there was space. My preferences were rarely asked, but always overridden gently. "You don't mind, right?" was the phrase that followed me most. And I rarely did mind, at least not enough to say so. Over time, I realized that the role I'd been assigned required a specific kind of silence. Not total absence, but controlled presence. I was allowed to contribute, but not to redirect, to assist, but not to lead, to support, but not to take up space in a way that altered the flow. It wasn't malicious. That's what made it harder to name. The people around me weren't trying to diminish me. They were relying on a version of me that had proven convenient, and I had helped build that version by being consistently agreeable. What struck me most was how surprised people seemed when I hesitated, even slightly. If I declined a request or asked for clarification, it was met with confusion, not anger, just a pause, as if the script had skipped a line. "Oh," someone would say, "I thought you'd be okay with it." That sentence carried more weight than it appeared to. It wasn't a question. It was a statement about who they believed I was. I began to understand that the role I played wasn't just about being overlooked. It was about being predictable. My calm, my flexibility, my restraint, they were all features of a system that worked smoothly because I absorbed the friction. And systems resist change. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This role had protected me once. It had allowed me to belong without conflict. But now it was limiting me, keeping me in a space where my presence was useful but not fully acknowledged. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me tired. Tired of being pre-edited. Tired of being summarized by others. Tired of being appreciated only for how little I disrupted the narrative. I didn't want to dismantle the family. I didn't want to confront anyone dramatically. I simply wanted to exist without being reduced to a function. Understanding the role didn't mean rejecting everyone who benefited from it. It meant recognizing that I no longer wanted to perform it unconsciously. That awareness was quiet, but it was decisive. Because once you see the role you've been assigned, you're faced with a choice. Continue playing it for the sake of harmony, or step out of it and accept whatever discomfort follows. At that point, I hadn't acted yet. I hadn't said anything out loud. But internally, something had shifted. I was no longer willing to disappear politely. The shift didn't happen during an argument or a dramatic confrontation. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, weeks after the graduation celebration, in a space where no one else was present to witness it. I was alone in my apartment, sitting at the small desk by the window. The light was soft, late afternoon, the kind that makes everything look gentler than it is. I'd opened my leather-bound notebook, not with an intention to analyze my family or my past, but simply to organize my thoughts. Lists had always helped me feel grounded. At first, I wrote mundane things, errands, deadlines, appointments. But my pen slowed, then stopped. Without quite deciding to, I turned to a blank page and wrote a single question. When did I start believing my presence was optional? I stared at the sentence longer than I expected to. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it had been waiting to be written. What followed wasn't anger. It was something quieter, more unsettling, recognition. I began jotting down moments, not to accuse, but to understand. The missed photo, the summarized identity, the casual assumptions. None of them, on their own, justified outrage. Together, they formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. I realized then that I had been confusing peace with self-erasure. I had believed that staying quiet kept relationships intact, that adapting meant maturity, that being easy was a virtue. But sitting there, alone with my own handwriting, I saw the cost more clearly. I had been editing myself preemptively, removing needs before they could inconvenience anyone. The shift came when I asked myself another question, one I had never allowed before. What would actually happen if I stopped doing that? Not in theory, in practice. The answer wasn't catastrophic. No visions of family collapse or permanent estrangement appeared. What surfaced instead was uncertainty, awkwardness, discomfort, and beneath that, a surprising sense of relief. I understood then that my fear wasn't of conflict, it was of being seen differently, of losing the approval that came from being reliable and undemanding, of stepping out of a role that had become familiar, even if it no longer fit. That afternoon, I didn't make a plan. I didn't rehearse speeches or imagine confrontations. I simply decided on one thing. I would stop explaining myself in advance. That decision was small, almost invisible, but it changed how I moved through the following days. I paused before saying yes automatically. I noticed when I felt the urge to smooth over tension that wasn't mine to manage. I let silence exist where I used to fill it. Nothing dramatic happened at first. No one called me out. No one reacted strongly. But internally, the difference was unmistakable. I felt more present, more grounded, less fragmented. For the first time, my silence felt like a choice rather than an expectation. And that distinction mattered more than I realized. The shift wasn't about asserting dominance or reclaiming power in a performative way. It was about alignment, about allowing my external behavior to reflect an internal truth I had been avoiding. I didn't know then how quickly that internal change would ripple outward. I didn't anticipate how fragile the old dynamics actually were. I only knew that I couldn't unsee what I'd seen. And once you stop negotiating your worth internally, the world around you starts to respond, sometimes subtly, sometimes all at once. That afternoon, the window wasn't visible to anyone else, but it was the moment the story turned. Because from that point on, my silence was no longer a void. It was a boundary. After that afternoon, nothing about my life looked different on the surface. I still attended family gatherings. I still answered messages. I still showed up on time, prepared and composed. If anyone had been watching closely, they might have said I was exactly the same. But I wasn't. The silence I carried no longer came from self-erasure. It came from intention. I stopped volunteering explanations before anyone asked for them. When plans were made without consulting me, I didn't rush to accommodate or apologize for existing on a different timeline. I responded when it made sense to respond, not when habit told me I should. At first, the changes were subtle enough that they went unnoticed. And when they were noticed, they were misinterpreted. People assumed I was busy, or tired, or distracted. One relative joked that I was harder to pin down lately, and laughed as if it were temporary. No one asked what had changed, because no one expected change from me. That assumption worked in my favor. Silence, when chosen deliberately, creates space. And in that space, patterns reveal themselves more clearly. I began observing without intervening, watching how decisions were made when I didn't step in to facilitate, noting how quickly confusion surfaced when I didn't smooth things over. It wasn't malicious, it was mechanical. A system accustomed to my quiet labor didn't know how to function without it. And instead of rushing to fix it, I let it be. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't a strategy in the dramatic sense. It was data. When someone asked for my help at the last minute, as they often did, I paused before answering. Sometimes I said yes. Sometimes I said no. And when I said no, I didn't justify it with elaborate reasons. I simply declined. The reactions were telling. There was surprise, mild disappointment, occasionally awkward silence. But there was also adaptation. People found alternatives. They adjusted. The world didn't collapse. Each time a small part of me relaxed, I realized how much emotional labor I had been performing unconsciously. How often I had absorbed stress that wasn't mine, simply because I could. Stepping back didn't make me less caring. It made me more honest. What surprised me most was how quickly others filled in the gaps I left behind. Tasks I had always handled alone were suddenly shared. Responsibilities redistributed. The family didn't fall apart without my constant maintenance. It simply reconfigured. And that reconfiguration revealed something important. My silence had been mistaken for weakness, but my presence had been mistaken for obligation. By choosing when to speak and when not to, I disrupted that equation. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't issue ultimatums. I let my behavior speak for itself. And in doing so, I learned who noticed and who didn't. Some people adjusted easily. They checked in. They asked instead of assuming. Others seemed unsettled, as if something essential had gone missing, but they couldn't name what it was. That discomfort wasn't mine to resolve. The more I allowed silence to exist, the clearer my own priorities became. I noticed how often I'd agreed to things out of reflex rather than desire, how rarely I'd asked myself what I actually wanted. Choosing silence wasn't about withholding, it was about listening to myself first. And in that quiet, I began to prepare, not for confrontation, but for truth. I paid closer attention. I documented interactions, not obsessively, but thoughtfully. I noticed who benefited from my silence and who respected it. Others still underestimated me. They mistook my calm for passivity, my restraint for indifference. They assumed that because I wasn't reacting, I wasn't registering. They were wrong. Silence, when it becomes a choice, is not empty. It's observant, it's patient, and it's powerful in ways that noise never is. What they never noticed was how much I was paying attention, not in a suspicious way, not with resentment or calculation. It was quieter than that, more deliberate. When I stopped filling the space with my own explanations and accommodations, I had room to observe what had always been there. I noticed patterns first. Who spoke when decisions were being made? Who assumed agreement without checking? Who only reached out when something was needed? And who reached out simply to connect? These weren't revelations meant to indict anyone. They were facts. And facts, once seen clearly, have a way of grounding you. I began keeping notes, not because I planned to confront anyone, but because writing helped me stay honest with myself. Dates, phrases, context, not interpretations, just what was said and what followed. I wanted clarity, not a story shaped by emotion. What emerged was consistency. When I stepped back, certain people stepped forward, confidently, sometimes clumsily. Others hesitated, unsure how to proceed without my quiet facilitation. And a few seemed to float, waiting for things to resolve themselves as they always had. I noticed how often responsibility defaulted to me when things were ambiguous, and how rarely that responsibility was acknowledged afterward, how praise flowed freely for visible success, but maintenance work remained unnamed. None of this was new. What was new was my refusal to immediately correct or compensate for it. I also noticed my own instincts shifting. I stopped anticipating needs that hadn't been expressed. I stopped preparing for outcomes that weren't my responsibility. I let people experience the natural consequences of their assumptions. And slowly something else became visible: leverage. Not leverage in the manipulative sense, not secrets or power plays, but informational leverage, emotional clarity, a grounded understanding of where I stood and where others stood in relation to me. I realized I had been a central node in many family logistics simply because I was reliable and discreet. Information passed through me. Plans were confirmed through me. Details were clarified by me. When I stopped actively managing that flow, gaps appeared. No one accused me of withholding. They simply felt less certain. And uncertainty makes people pay attention. I also began to notice moments of quiet respect, small but meaningful. A relative who asked before assuming, a pause before assigning me a task, a message that acknowledged my time instead of claiming it. Those moments mattered more than the louder reactions. What they never noticed was that I wasn't collecting grievances. I was collecting understanding. I was learning how the system functioned without my constant input, and what that revealed about my actual position within it. I learned who valued harmony and who valued convenience, who mistook my kindness for compliance, and who quietly had always seen me more clearly than I'd allowed myself to see. Preparation for me wasn't about planning a reveal or staging a moment. It was about alignment, making sure that when I did speak, if I chose to speak, I would be doing so from a place of steadiness, not reaction. I didn't rehearse speeches. I didn't imagine outcomes. I focused on one thing only: integrity. That meant being honest with myself about what I was no longer willing to accept, about the roles I wouldn't resume out of habit, about the boundaries I wouldn't need to announce because my behavior would make them evident. The irony was that the quieter I became, the more visible the dynamics grew. People often assume that power announces itself, that it arrives with volume and certainty. But there is a different kind of power that comes from not needing to prove anything. only to understand. They never noticed the preparation because it didn't look like preparation. It looked like distance, like calm, like nothing at all. But underneath that calm was clarity. And clarity, once formed, doesn't rush. It waits until the moment it's needed. The private reveal didn't come with a rush of emotion or a dramatic sense of victory. It arrived quietly, almost gently, in a moment that felt more clarifying than shocking. I was reviewing my notes one evening, not searching for anything in particular, just rereading to stay grounded. Patterns tend to sharpen when you see them laid out plainly, without the blur of intention or memory. And as I read, something aligned in a way it hadn't before. I saw how often information had flowed through me without being recognized as such, how decisions depended on my follow-through, how assumptions about my availability had allowed others to move faster, lighter, without carrying the weight of coordination or consequence. It wasn't that I held secrets. It was that I held structure. And structure, when removed or redistributed, changes everything. The reveal wasn't about power over people. It was about understanding my actual position, one I had never claimed, but had consistently occupied. I had been a stabilizing force, not because anyone appointed me, but because I had stepped into that space repeatedly without question. Seeing that clearly did something unexpected. It softened me. I felt no urge to confront or correct anyone immediately. No desire to announce my importance or demand acknowledgement. What I felt instead was calm certainty, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. For the first time, I understood that my value didn't depend on whether others recognized it. It existed independently, evidenced by how much it was quietly relied on. That understanding became leverage, not in how I acted toward others, but in how I acted toward myself. I stopped doubting my perceptions. I stopped minimizing my contributions internally. I stopped waiting for external confirmation before trusting my own experience. The reveal also showed me something else. I didn't need to expose anything for change to occur. I didn't need to list grievances or present evidence. The dynamics were already shifting simply because I was no longer propping them up unconsciously. What I had uncovered wasn't a weakness in others. It was a truth about myself. I had underestimated the impact of my own restraint. And with that clarity came responsibility, not to fix anyone, not to rebalance every relationship, but to choose deliberately how and where I would engage going forward. I asked myself difficult questions. If I spoke, what would I be hoping to change? If I stayed silent, what would I be protecting? And most importantly, what outcome would align with my values, not just my comfort? The answers weren't immediate. They didn't arrive as instructions. They arrived as boundaries, clearer than any rule I could have written. I knew I wouldn't return to my old role. I knew I wouldn't confront out of frustration. And I knew that when I did speak, it would be measured, honest, and irreversible. There was no celebration attached to that realization. No sense of triumph. Just a deep, settling clarity. The private reveal wasn't something I shared with anyone else. It didn't need validation. It simply reoriented me. And once that internal alignment was set, the next steps weren't rushed. They were chosen. Clarity always leads to a choice. Not immediately, but inevitably. Once I understood my position within the family, once I saw the structure I had been holding together without acknowledgement, I reached a quiet crossroads. Nothing forced it. No one demanded an answer. But internally, the question became unavoidable. What do I do with what I know? There were several options available to me, each with its own cost. I could confront everyone directly, lay out the pattern, cite examples, and explain how their assumptions had affected me. That path promised visibility, but also defensiveness. I could already imagine the responses: surprise, denial, apologies tangled with justification. It would require emotional labor I no longer felt responsible for. I could withdraw completely, reduce contact, stop showing up, let absence speak for itself. That option felt tempting in moments of fatigue, but it carried a kind of finality I wasn't ready for. Disappearance would protect me, but it would also collapse the possibility of an honest connection. Or I could do something quieter and more decisive. I could change my behavior without explanation and speak only when clarity required it. That option didn't offer immediate relief. It didn't guarantee understanding or validation, but it aligned with the internal shift I had already made. It allowed me to remain present without being performative, to act with integrity rather than reaction. The decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't come with a surge of courage or a rehearsed plan. It came with a sense of finality that surprised me. I decided I would no longer preemptively accommodate roles that diminished me. I decided I would allow others to experience the natural consequences of their assumptions. And I decided that if a conversation needed to happen, it would be honest, contained, and unrepeatable. That last part mattered most. I didn't want a cycle of discussions that reopened old dynamics without resolving them. I didn't want to negotiate my worth in installments. If I spoke, it would be once, clearly enough that it wouldn't need to be revisited. That decision changed how I listened. I became more selective about what I engaged with. When someone spoke over me, I didn't interrupt, but I didn't reinsert myself either. When plans excluded me, I didn't correct them unless they affected me directly. I let absence stand as information. I wasn't testing anyone, I was testing my own resolve. And in doing so, I learned something unexpected. Not every relationship needs to be rebalanced to remain meaningful. Some simply need to be redefined. The decision point wasn't about asserting dominance. It was about choosing coherence over comfort, about aligning my external actions with the internal clarity I had already reached. I didn't know exactly how things would unfold. I didn't anticipate the speed with which others would feel the shift. I only knew that returning to the old version of myself was no longer an option. Once you reach that point, indecision becomes its own form of self-betrayal. So I chose, quietly, deliberately, without announcement, and that choice set everything else in motion. After the decision was made, I didn't feel lighter. If anything, I felt more deliberate. Every action carried weight now, not because it was dramatic, but because it was intentional. I moved in silence, not as a tactic, but as a principle. There were practical shifts first. I stopped acting as the default coordinator for family logistics. When messages came through asking for confirmation, clarification, or follow-up, I responded only when the responsibility genuinely belonged to me. I didn't chase loose ends. I didn't remind people of things they hadn't taken ownership of themselves. At work, I did something similar. I continued doing my job well, but I stopped absorbing overflow that wasn't mine. When tasks were ambiguous, I asked clarifying questions instead of filling the gaps automatically. When timelines were unrealistic, I named the constraints calmly and let others adjust. No one accused me of changing. That's the thing about moving in silence. It rarely triggers alarms at first. Instead, people filled in the narrative themselves. She's busy lately. She has a lot going on. She'll get back to it. I let those assumptions exist without correcting them. What I didn't do was withdraw emotionally. I didn't become cold or distant. I stayed present in conversations. I listened carefully. I just stopped managing outcomes. And that was the most disruptive change of all. In families, emotional labor often goes unnoticed until it's no longer provided. The absence doesn't feel like conflict. It feels like friction. Plans take longer. Decisions feel heavier. Small misunderstandings linger instead of being smoothed over. I watched this happen without intervening. At one point, a family gathering nearly fell apart because no one had confirmed details. Normally, I would have stepped in quietly, made a few calls, and resolved it. This time, I didn't. Someone else eventually did. The event went on. It wasn't perfect, but it happened. That moment mattered more to me than anyone else involved. It confirmed something I needed to see. My restraint wasn't destructive, it was redistributive. I also became more intentional about where I invested energy. I showed up fully for relationships that felt reciprocal. When someone asked how I was doing and waited for the answer, I noticed. When someone checked in without needing anything, I remembered. Those moments didn't change the system overnight, but they clarified which connections were grounded in mutual regard rather than convenience. Moving in silence required discipline. There were moments when I felt the old reflex rise, the urge to fix, to smooth, to explain. Each time I paused, I asked myself whether stepping in would serve alignment or habit. More often than not, it was a habit. The most difficult part wasn't holding my boundaries. It was allowing others to misinterpret my silence. Some assume disengagement, others assume compliance. A few assume nothing at all. I let them, because silence doesn't need to be understood to be effective. It only needs to be consistent. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly that consistency would begin to shift the emotional temperature around me. People became more careful with their requests. more precise with their language, less casual in their assumptions. Not everyone noticed consciously, but they felt it. The space I no longer filled didn't stay empty. It reorganized itself. And still, I hadn't said anything. Not because I was avoiding conversation, but because I was waiting for the right one. The kind that doesn't arise from frustration or accumulation. The kind that happens when the timing is honest. The kind that doesn't need to be repeated. Moving in silence wasn't the end of the story. It was the approach. The consequences didn't arrive with confrontation. They arrived as an absence. Not my absence from the family, but the absence of what I used to provide without being asked. And once that absence settled in, people began to feel it. Subtly at first, then with increasing clarity. It showed up in small delays. Messages that went unanswered longer than usual. Plans that felt slightly disorganized. Decisions that stalled because no one wanted to take responsibility for finalizing them. Nothing catastrophic, just friction where there used to be flow. I noticed the shift before anyone named it. A relative called me one evening, sounding uncertain. "I just wanted to check," they said. "Did we confirm the schedule for next weekend?" Their tone wasn't accusatory. It was hesitant, as if they weren't sure whether it was still appropriate to ask. "I'm not coordinating this one," I replied calmly. "I thought someone else had it." There was a pause, then, "Oh, okay." That was it. No conflict, no explanation. But something in the dynamic shifted in that moment. The assumption had been interrupted. Over time, those interruptions accumulated. People began double-checking instead of assuming, asking instead of assigning. The ease with which my time had once been claimed gave way to a more careful approach. Not everyone adjusted gracefully. Some reacted with mild frustration. "Things feel more complicated lately," someone remarked during a conversation that wasn't meant to include me, but did. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Others responded with confusion. They sensed a change but couldn't locate it. They spoke about it abstractly, as if the family itself had become less efficient, without considering the role I'd played in that efficiency. What struck me most was how rarely my name came up in those observations. The impact was felt, but the source remained unnamed. That, more than anything, confirmed what I'd already understood. I had been invisible, not irrelevant. As the weeks passed, the consequences extended beyond logistics. Emotional expectations began to shift too. People stopped leaning on me as their default listener for unresolved frustrations. Some found other outlets. Others kept things to themselves. I noticed fewer late-night calls framed as just needing to vent. Fewer assumptions that I would be available to absorb emotional overflow. And while part of me missed the closeness those moments had implied, another part recognized the imbalance they'd often carried. The relationships that remained steady through this shift, those were the ones that mattered most. A cousin who checked in without needing anything. An aunt who asked my opinion and waited for it. A quiet message that acknowledged the change without questioning it. Those gestures weren't dramatic, but they were intentional. The consequences weren't punishment. They were recalibrating. I didn't feel satisfaction watching others struggle slightly. I felt relief. Relief that the system was no longer dependent on my silent labor. Relief that my boundaries were holding without enforcement. What surprised me was how quickly some people adapted once they realized things wouldn't revert. Humans are remarkably flexible when they understand that old patterns are no longer available. Others, however, began to push. They framed their requests differently, more politely, more indirectly, as if adjusting the language might restore the previous access. I responded with the same calm consistency. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Always without over-explanation. That consistency became its own message. I wasn't angry. I wasn't withdrawing. I simply wasn't available in the same way anymore. And slowly, the family began to operate differently. Not better or worse, just more honestly. The consequences had begun, and they were irreversible, not because I enforced them, but because I no longer compensated for their absence. The moment it became clear that things couldn't simply be fixed was subtle, but unmistakable. It wasn't marked by an argument or a declaration. It arrived in the form of delayed realization. People began to sense that something had changed permanently, not just temporarily. The old dynamics weren't coming back no matter how politely they were requested. At first, There were small attempts to restore familiarity, invitations framed with nostalgia. Comments like, "We should get back to how we used to do things," were said with a light laugh, as if repetition could summon the past. I didn't resist those comments. I didn't correct them either. I listened, nodded, and let the present speak for itself. That's when the confusion set in. Some family members grew anxious, not outwardly, but in subtle ways. They asked more questions than before, sought reassurance indirectly, checked in under the guise of concern. "Are you okay?" someone asked me one afternoon. "Yes," I replied, and I meant it. They waited, as if expecting more. An explanation, a confession, a sign that this was a phase. When none came, the conversation drifted elsewhere. It wasn't that they wanted me to be unhappy. They wanted me to be familiar, and I no longer was. The realization that things were too late to fix didn't come from defiance on my part. It came from alignment. I wasn't withholding myself, I was simply no longer overextending. That distinction mattered, but it was hard for others to grasp. Some tried to compensate by offering appreciation after the fact. "We really rely on you," someone said, almost as a compliment. I thanked them politely and didn't step back into the role. Others expressed mild regret, framed as self-awareness. "I guess we took you for granted a bit," a relative admitted during a quiet moment. I acknowledged the honesty and changed nothing. Because acknowledgement without change doesn't restore trust. It only names the loss. What they were sensing wasn't resentment, it was finality. The part of me that had once filled every gap automatically was no longer available. And no apology, however sincere, could bring her back because she no longer existed. That's a difficult thing to accept, especially in families where continuity is assumed. I watched people cycle through reactions: confusion, nostalgia, subtle frustration, tentative acceptance. Not all at once, not uniformly. Each person processed the shift in their own time. I didn't rush them. I didn't guide them through it. Their discomfort wasn't mine to manage anymore. The hardest moment came when someone said, almost wistfully, "You've changed." I looked at them calmly and replied, "I've become more honest." There was nothing confrontational in my tone, but the statement landed with weight, because honesty, once established, doesn't negotiate. That was the moment I knew there was no going back. Not because I had closed a door, but because I had stepped fully into a space that no longer fit the old dynamics. Fixing things would have required me to return to being smaller, quieter, and more accommodating than I was willing to be. And that wasn't repaired, that was regression. So I let the shift stand, not as punishment, not as rejection, but as the natural outcome of choosing myself without apology. By then, it was too late to fix what had depended on my silence. And that was exactly as it needed to be. The conversation happened not because I demanded it, but because avoiding it had become impossible. It took place on an ordinary afternoon, over coffee, with someone who mattered enough to warrant honesty, but not enough to receive performance. There was no audience, no build-up, just a quiet recognition that something unspoken had reached its limit. They were the ones who finally said it plainly. "I feel like you've been distant," they said. Not accusing, just uncertain. I didn't rush to reassure them. I let the silence sit for a moment, long enough to make sure my response wasn't reflexive. "I haven't been distant," I said calmly. "I've been present in a different way." They frowned slightly, processing. "I don't understand." And that was the opening, not for explanation, but for clarity. I didn't list examples. I didn't revisit old moments or catalog grievances. I spoke simply, carefully, the way you speak when you've already made peace with your own position. "For a long time," I said, "I made myself smaller so things would run smoothly. I didn't realize how much of myself I was removing to make that happen." There was no edge in my voice, no emotional charge, just truth, stated without urgency. They tried to interrupt, to soften it. "We never meant—" "I know," I said gently. "This isn't about intention." That stopped them. I explained that I wasn't angry, that I didn't feel wronged in the dramatic sense. What I felt was clarity, and clarity had changed how I showed up. "I'm not stepping away from anyone," I said. "I'm just not stepping in automatically anymore." The room stayed quiet, not tense, just still. They asked if there was something they could do: fix, adjust, restore. I considered the question carefully before answering. "No," I said. Ten in person, not retroactively. That was the hardest part for them to hear. I wasn't asking for apologies. I wasn't offering instructions. I wasn't opening a negotiation. I was naming a boundary that already existed. This isn't something we solve, I continued. It's something we move forward with, differently. They looked unsettled, but not defensive. More like someone realizing they'd been leaning on a wall that had quietly moved. What does that mean for us? They asked. It means honesty, I said, and mutual effort. Or it means less closeness. I'm okay with either as long as it's real. There was no ultimatum in my tone, no demand for reassurance, just an invitation rooted in self-respect. The conversation didn't end with a resolution. It ended with understanding, partial, incomplete, but sincere. And that was enough. I didn't feel drained afterward. I didn't replay the words or second-guess my delivery. There was no adrenaline crash, no emotional aftermath, because confrontation without heat doesn't seek control. It seeks alignment. For the first time, I had spoken without needing the other person to agree with me in order to feel steady. Their reaction mattered, but it didn't define the outcome. That conversation didn't change everyone. It didn't need to. It changed me. I walked away knowing that whatever followed would be based on truth, not habit, on choice, not obligation. And that quiet certainty stayed with me long after the coffee had gone cold. Who I am now isn't defined by contrast to who I used to be. It's defined by continuity, by the parts of myself that were always there, finally allowed to exist without negotiation. I'm still calm, still observant, still someone who values harmony. But harmony no longer means disappearance. It means balance. And balance requires presence. I no longer pre-edit myself to fit into rooms. If I have something to say, I say it. Briefly, honestly, without softening it into harmlessness. If I don't, I let silence stand without apology. Both feel natural now. My relationships look different, but not emptier. Some have deepened, grounded in mutual recognition rather than convenience. Others have grown quieter, less demanding, more distant. I've learned not to chase either outcome. Not every connection is meant to survive honesty, and that's not a failure. In my family, I'm no longer the default, and that's a relief. I'm invited now, not assumed. Asked, not assigned. When I decline, it's accepted without commentary. When I participate, it's noticed, not as a function, but as a person. That shift didn't require constant reinforcement. It held because I held it. I've also noticed something else. People speak to me differently, more directly, with more care. Not because I've become intimidating, but because I've become clear. Clarity invites respect. At work, I'm still reliable, but not invisible. I contribute without overextending. I collaborate without absorbing. And when something doesn't align, I name it early, calmly, without waiting for resentment to build. The emotional labor I once carried unconsciously has been redistributed to where it belongs. What I don't feel anymore is guilt. I don't feel guilty for not anticipating needs that haven't been expressed. I don't feel guilty for saying no without justification. And I don't feel guilty for letting others sit with discomfort that isn't mine to resolve. That absence of guilt isn't indifference. It's self-trust. The version of me that tried to earn belonging through usefulness is gone. Not because she was weak, but because she was tired. In her place is someone quieter, steadier, and far less willing to disappear. I don't resent my family. I understand them better now. I see how systems form, how roles solidify, how good intentions can still cause harm when they go unexamined. And I see my part in all of it, clearly, without shame. Who I am now is someone who can be present without performing, who can love without overgiving, who can speak without needing to be heard by everyone. That version of me doesn't need to prove anything. She just exists, fully, honestly, and without apology. There's a quiet kind of ending that doesn't feel like an ending at all. No final confrontation, no dramatic reconciliation, just a sense that something has settled into its proper place. That's where this story rests. Looking back, I don't frame what happened as a victory. I didn't win anything. I didn't outmaneuver anyone. What I did was stop abandoning myself in small, habitual ways and allowed the truth of that choice to ripple outward. The moral of this story isn't that families are cruel or that being quiet is a flaw. It's those patterns that patterns persist, not because they're malicious, but because they're unexamined. And often the people who benefit most from those patterns are the least aware of them, including us. For a long time, I believed that love meant adaptability, that maturity meant swallowing discomfort, that being easy was the price of belonging. None of those beliefs was entirely wrong, but they were incomplete. Love without honesty becomes maintenance. Adaptability without limits becomes erasure. And peace without self-respect becomes silence that costs too much. What changed everything wasn't confrontation. It wasn't exposure. It wasn't even the graduation celebration itself. It was one honest conversation, preceded by many honest moments with myself. When I stopped explaining my absence from the center of things, the system had to adjust. When I stopped filling gaps automatically, others learned where the gaps actually were. And when I spoke calmly, without heat or accusation, what had been hidden unraveled faster than anyone expected. Not because I pushed, but because the truth no longer needed support to stand. There's something powerful about quiet dominance that's often misunderstood. It's not control, it's coherence. It's knowing who you are, what you will and won't carry, and allowing that clarity to shape your life without spectacle. I don't tell this story to suggest that everyone should withdraw, or stop being generous, or speak only once. Every situation is different. Every family has its own language, its own history, its own wounds. I tell it because sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't to demand to be seen, but to stop making yourself invisible. If this story resonated with you, it may not be because our circumstances match. It may be because you've felt the quiet exhaustion of always being the one who adjusts, the one who smooths, the one who understands. And maybe, just maybe, you've wondered what would happen if you didn't. So I'll leave you with one question, not a challenge, just an invitation to reflect. In your own life, where might silence be something you've been giving, when it's actually something you're allowed to choose? If you feel comfortable, I'd love to hear your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Sometimes naming a pattern is the first step toward changing it, and sometimes that's enough.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.